Hello, everybody. I have an amazing founder, Jay from Say. Thank you for being here, Jay.
Bro, thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, appreciate you being here at the summit and carving out a couple minutes to dive deeper on Say. So I like to generally start with the origin story. Give us a little bit of a sense of what was happening in your life and your world at the time that you broke into crypto, and then fast forward a little bit to your encounter with the value proposition of Say. Why was it worth building, and how did you get into it?
Of course. So I initially got into crypto back in 2017. It's actually a pretty crazy story. So back then, Facebook would give new hires that are joining $100,000 signing bonuses. And my friends were graduating. They'd got their share of the signing bonus, and some of them like literally dumped it all into Ether. And this is back when Ether was trading at $40 per token. So I saw them do this. I'm like, this is literally the worst idea I've ever heard of in my life. And then I saw it go up and up and up. And I saw them basically write it up and make a lot of money from that. And I'm like, damn, this is pretty insane. Afterwards, I saw them lose it all because, as happens in crypto, people open very degenerate positions. But I kind of saw the financial side of crypto from that. And then afterwards, after I graduated, I moved in with one of my roommates who, at that time, he was still a master's student at Stanford, and he was starting a crypto company and going through Binance Labs. And that's when I learned more about the actual development side of crypto. Like, what are how do you write smart contracts? What are the use cases of building in crypto? And I think that made me much more just bullish on crypto from the financial and technological side. Fast forward to 2021, I was an engineering lead at Robinhood at the time. And I was there when the entire GameStop saga went down. So for anyone that might not know too much about it, I mean,
it's meme coins before meme coins.
Yeah, it was the meme stock era. Yeah, so there were like a dozen stocks, GameStop, AMC, roughly 10 others. And these were stocks that were just like starting to pump really, really hard. And the reason for that is because there was this kind of national support for these companies. And it was kind of like sticking up the middle finger to Wall Street in a way. Because Wall Street was like trying to short these stocks. And a lot of normal people, they were buying into these stocks. And what ended up happening is when normal people bought in, the price went up. And then these people that had opened short positions, they would need to then buy back the stock in order to close their short position to prevent more losses. When you buy back the stock, guess what? The price goes up even more. So there was this massive short squeeze that was happening. And then just one day out of the blue, Robinhood completely turned off buys. And it just came out of nowhere. There wasn't really prior communication to customers. So everyone around the country was just either confused or super, super angry. And that was kind of the inspiration for Say initially. Like, I felt incredibly powerless when that happened. All of my friends were hitting me up. They're like, yo, man, what the hell is happening over here? And I mean, I was kind of putting my reputation on the line by working there. And I had nothing to really be telling them because the Robinhood founders told us stuff the same time that they told the new stuff. So because of that, we're like, okay, what if we built a decentralized Robinhood? And that was the initial inspiration for Say back in 2021. We're like, let's build a DEX. This then led to us going down this entire kind of journey where we tried looking into what infrastructure we could build on. We realized that the infrastructure is lacking. And fast forward to now, we finally got a layer 1 blockchain built. And I think there's been just so many learnings across the way. Like back in August of 2023, we were a CosmWasm only chain. So you could only write smart contracts in Rust for the CosmWasm virtual machine. And this is really bad because there's not very many CosmWasm developers. And I mean, no one was building on Say back then. It was that really forced us to like do a deep introspection in terms of like what is going wrong and what can we do to better support users. So ever since then, we focused on building and supporting the EVM and making use of the existing stack that we already had, supporting the parallelized EVM, which essentially lets developers get the best of both Ethereum and Solana, where they're able to get the EVM and the mindshare, tooling, developers, users that come with that, along with the speed that you see with chains like Solana. So yeah, we went live with that July of earlier this year. And since then, I would say every metric that matters in terms of user adoption, it's just been up and to the right. So it's a good time to be on Say.
Yeah, awesome. So you're speaking about selecting your tech stack.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important challenge that founders face. Tell me a little bit more about how you optimized around EVM compatibility and speed on Solana, and coming from Rust and CosmWasm to be welcoming to all and able to support the different use cases?
Yeah. So back when we initially got started, we started building layer 1 back in 2022. And we're like, okay, we're going to start using CosmWasm because that feels better to us in a way, because that solves for things like reentrancy attacks that you'd see with the EVM. And we're like, we'll support EVM in the future. Like, we're not going to worry about it too much right now. So we went live August of 2023, and developers were it was difficult to convince developers to build on Say, because nearly every crypto native developer right now is an EVM developer. Like, there was the Electric Capital report that was released last year. I think there's going to be another one that's coming out soon as well. And in the last one, it was like around 85, 90% of developers were CosmWasm or were EVM devs. Like, outside of those, there's a contingent of Solana developers, and basically no one is using Move. Basically no one is using CosmWasm. And that really forced us to think, like, we're building this for developers, but developers don't want to build on us. And why is that? Well, turns out everyone just wants EVM support. So that was the kind of big unlock that we had. And that led to us thinking, okay, EVM is critical. What is lacking from the EVM right now? And that led to us, asking developers again. And the biggest things we realized is that a lack of throughput resulted in really high gas fees for users. And it led to a very restricted design space for developers. Like, if you're building with an EVM chain right now outside of Say, you're probably not getting more than 50 transactions per second. And you need to build really clunky applications as a result of that. Like, one example over here, automated market makers like Uniswap. That does not exist in traditional finance. Like, that is just not a concept because it's extremely capital inefficient. But in the case of like Ethereum and building on-chain right now, that's become a very common pattern because it just fits these constraints that you see on-chain. And if you think about an application like Google, for example, Google processes 100,000 searches per second. There's literally no chain out there right now that can do that. 100,000 complex transactions per second. No one can do something like that. So I think there's a massive disconnect between Web3 and Web2. And that's really what we want to solve. We want to build an extremely scalable EVM so that ideally you can build applications like Google entirely on-chain, and no one is capable of doing that right now.
Quick clarification, why would you want to build Google on-chain?
So yeah, so that's an example in terms of the kind of throughput that you would want to see. I think Google specifically is just like, that's more to paint the kind of throughput requirement that you would want.
But maybe a large payment network.
Oh, 100%.
Sure, makes sense. And in that context, tell me more about the other challenges you faced that you think other founders are facing, but have something to learn from you.
Yeah, we have been through a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
The very first one that comes to mind is fundraising. So every single time that we've gone out to raise has probably been the worst time of that year to try to raise money. Yeah, like initially we got started trying to raise right after Terra had collapsed. Oof. And as you can imagine, like there wasn't that much investor interest.
Yeah.
I think also as founders, we weren't like super polished. I don't know if we are right now, but we definitely were not back then. From the product standpoint, it was also not very polished either. So it was really tough for us to raise money.
Yeah. Why not at L1, right?
Exactly. It was like, why are you building another L1? Like at that time, rollups were also really popular. So people were like, why aren't you building a rollup? And like we had our own reasons for that, but I think that went against the investment theses that a lot of funds had. So it was tough, and we got really lucky that Multicoin saw the potential in us. We were a very contrarian bet back then, and I think Multicoin has made a pretty good return by kind of taking that bet on us so far. But yeah, we ended up just having a ton of conversations. Everyone said no. And I think the core thing to take away for other founders from this is it's completely normal for everyone to say no to you. Like it's actually very rare for you to have multiple term sheets if you're a first-time founder, and like having, especially like tier 1 term sheets from like top funds. It's just really tough to do something like that. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Like even if you get top tier fund sheets or top tier term sheets, that doesn't mean you're going to succeed. The only thing that really matters is your perseverance and what kind of decisions you make to help make the company successful. So I think as long as you believe in yourself as a founder, it doesn't really matter what investors have to say, because most of the time investors are wrong. So you shouldn't really index too much on what investors think about you, especially when you're early on.
Yeah, if they were right all the time, they would just be building one thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Instead of investing into many.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how did you approach fundraising in the past? And based on what you've learned, how might you approach it differently now?
I think that in hindsight, we actually approached it the right way. Just trying to have as many conversations as we could and not really feeling discouraged when things didn't go our way.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't really change anything about that. But there were definitely times when like I was questioning, like, is this the right thing for us to be doing? Like all these investors that are like super legit in positions of authority, when they say no, it's kind of like saying they don't believe in you. I mean, fundamentally, that's what it is. So I would really brush that aside even more. Like, as long as I believe in me, I think that's what matters a lot more.
In terms of selecting the investors, what do you look at? Let's say you've got multiple participants, you have reached your point of how much you wanted to raise. How do you approach evaluating the options? How to give out your allocation? Who do you want to have at the table with you?
Yeah, I think there's several different things you want to account for. One part of it is signaling, which might be one of the most important things that you can get from investors. If you have a top tier fund like Multicoin around the table, it makes it much easier for like every single thing that happens in the future after that. It's much easier to hire folks. It's much easier to go through like the business development life cycle as well. So I think signaling is definitely very important. And if you do have the support of a tier one fund, I absolutely think like no brainer for you to take it, even if it's at a decreased valuation, because I think valuation is really fluffy. And I think the support that you get from the funds end up, especially from the signaling standpoint, is much more valuable. Besides that, I think it's going to be the actual value that they are able to offer. So there's, I think, a lot of earlier stage funds that really want to make a name for themselves, and they're really willing to roll up their sleeves and like go to bat for you. I think a lot of more established funds where you're one of like 1,000 investments that they have, they're going to be less intense about helping you. So I think really picking investors that are going to bat for you, not only with stuff like intros, but like helping spread the word about you, making you something that they consistently talk about to like all of their friends and folks that they meet. I think that really does move the needle. And those kinds of partners, I think, are ones that you really should try to work with.
And how did you approach team building?
Yeah, so we actually had a very interesting approach to hiring our initial team members. We didn't just hire people full-time initially. We had them work part-time while they were still at their jobs. It's like our initial founding team was engineers from like top Silicon Valley companies like Databricks, Robinhood, Google, Facebook, and every single one of them was spending evenings, weekends, just helping out with open source development. And by doing this, we were able to get a sense for how they worked in like an actual work environment. They got to learn more about us, and it was a much easier bet for them to make to join our team. And I think one thing that kind of indirectly happened that I didn't really anticipate beforehand is that if you spend 2 months working somewhere and like you've built out all this like core protocol, like you've written code for the core protocol, you're kind of invested in it. So you're less likely to interview at other places. You're more likely to just pick this company if there's like salary requirements that meet what you're looking for. So that allowed us to get a really strong engineering team from the get-go. And I think that's just been kind of fundamental to our culture. Like we have this very scrappy Silicon Valley mentality. We have a really high bar for hiring, just talent across the board. And I think the reason that we've been able to ship much faster than I would say most other projects in crypto is because we've been able to get this initial team around the table. So,
and do you still continue with that practice of onboarding team members that are going to be evening and weekenders before they join?
We try to. It really depends on that specific person's situation. I think as the company becomes bigger, people tend to be wanting to join full-time immediately. But whenever someone is open to that, we do try to do that. Because I think it just ends up being better for both sides.
Yeah, and gives you a chance to know what to expect and end up vetting each other a little.
Interview processes are so bad. Like it's from like 3 hours of conversations, you really don't know what that person's working style is like. You can get reference checks from your friends, and I think that helps a good amount. But like fundamentally, working with someone is the best way to gauge if they're going to work well with you versus like interviewing them. So I think that's probably been the single most helpful thing for us in terms of being able to execute as fast as we have been.
Speaking of adding team members, obviously the next point is where you source from and where they're located. How have you approached this remote company or in person?
Yeah, I think that we were fortunate when we got started that like me and my co-founder, we both grew up in the Bay Area. We went to like UC Berkeley, UCLA. So it was like pretty easy to get folks that are like talented engineers and talented operators to join us early on. And it was basically entirely in network. So it was like either our direct friends or our friends of friends. So that was, I think, something that was uniquely easy for us that a lot of other founders might have much more difficulty with if they didn't grow up in a similar type of environment. I think in terms of growing remotely, it's honestly really tough. Like as soon as we started diversifying from the Bay Area, like time zones became an issue. Tracking whether people were actually doing things became an issue as well. I think you need to just be very methodical about your hiring. Like we're still a completely remote company. We don't have an office at all. And I think it's been working overall because the kind of hiring process that I talked about before has been allowing us to like weed out the people who might just be like not working 40, 50-hour weeks, for example.
And how do you think about product market fit? When would you say, or did you say, Yep, now we've got it. We have the traction we needed to demonstrate to ourselves and the world that this works.
Yeah. In crypto, I think it's really interesting. And I think to start this off, I don't think we have product market fit yet.
Yeah.
I think we're still very early. And I think that there's still a huge amount of kind of traction that we need to get before we can really say that we have product market fit. In crypto, the way that I'm thinking about it right now is that there's 3 tiers. First is narrative market fit. Then after that, there's community market fit. And then there's product market fit. So narrative market fit.
And in your mind, are these chronological?
I would say these generally end up being chronological, yeah. So from the narrative market fit perspective, you need to have some product that you're building that people understand and that like makes sense, that gets them excited, right? If you don't have that, like literally no one's going to be willing to invest in you. No one's really going to be excited about being a community member in that ecosystem. So I think that's like the base level. After that comes community market fit. So this is when you get a ton of community members that are excited about being part of this ecosystem. And that's also when you start seeing more application developers coming on and starting to build in that ecosystem. And I think that's like when you start seeing huge amounts of excitement around a project. So one example of this would be Monad. I think Monad has community market fit. I think they've done a fantastic job of getting all these folks around the table that are just really strong proponents of Monad. And I mean, this is a pre-launch ecosystem, right? So I think that's pretty incredible. I think Solana has done something similar, but in their case, it happened post-launch. So I think these would be like a couple of examples you can look to over there. And then afterwards, I think product market fit happens when you have killer applications that are deployed in that ecosystem that really result in users coming on and actually doing stuff on your chain. So I think in Say's case, we still haven't had that killer app. Something like a pump.fun or a Polymarket that really results in people coming to your ecosystem. Yeah. And from our side, that's the biggest thing that we're focused on right now. Like we need to have at least one killer application come on to Say before we can really say that like we found product market fit and like we're like successful from an ecosystem perspective.
So you'd measure it based on the traction of the apps built on Say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that is the single most important thing that matters for any infrastructure layer project. Like, I mean, fundamentally, those are the customers. So which customers succeed from using your infrastructure?
So this expands a little bit of the value proposition point of why build on Say, right? Because if your key metric will be apps building on Say, what's the narrative, speaking of narrative fit, that says, yeah, actually getting beyond, you already shared a portion of it, which is get EVM and get high throughput, be able to customize. But what is it that resonates most with developers to give them the incentive? You know what? I'm not going to just test it out on Ethereum. I'm going to go to another L1. I'm not going to do rollup as a service. I'm going to go to an L1. What is the magnetizer variable or the narrative that pushes them over the edge from other alternatives to building on Say?
Yeah. So to be completely intellectually honest here, I think that the technology is just one aspect of why projects pick an ecosystem. I think the biggest reason that projects pick ecosystems is because they think they will win in that ecosystem. And winning can cover different things. I think for a lot of devs, it's just where they can make the most money, like where they can launch a token and like make the most money. I think for other developers, it's where do they build the best product that's able to acquire more users. But fundamentally, like where do they win? So that's kind of how you have to think about it from an application developer standpoint when you're selling them which ecosystem to be building on. The reason that I think they've been building on Say is because there's just been a huge amount of traction that we've started seeing in the past 6 months or so, ever since the parallel EVM went live. And I think it tends to be kind of a virtuous cycle where once you start seeing some stuff getting built, that makes it more justified for other people to come in. And people do want to come in early. Like if you're going to be at the ground stages of something that becomes a rocket ship, you have so much more to gain than if you join when it's already like number 4, like for example, like building on Solana or BNB.
Yeah.
So from a developer standpoint, that's kind of how they think about it. The way that I think about it, like for what the long-term vision for us is I really want there to be no difference between building in Web2 and building in Web3, right? Like right now it's so clunky to build in Web3, and we're talking about Google before. I think you can't build anything of that magnitude, anything that requires throughput like that on chain right now. So I think that if you're able to take the EVM and you're really able to build that type of infrastructure that is getting that, I mean, compared to right now, like more than 100x improvement in throughput, I think if you're able to get there, that's when the infrastructure will be at a stage where like you can actually build whatever type of application you want to. Because right now, like you're very restricted in terms of design space. And even with, say, the parallelized EVM right now, I think there's still more work that we need to do before it's really reaching that point where like it is the same thing as like building in Web2.
Yeah. Help me see that vision a little bit more clearly. How do you get the developer experience to be closer to what they've been used to in Web2? What is the tool suite? What's the offerings that empower them to do what they've always been able to do and now better and on-chain?
Yeah, I think that there's generally two ways that I think about it.
Yeah.
One part is from performance. The second is from user experience. So from the performance standpoint, I think that you need to be offering minimum levels of throughput and latency. The throughput is how many transactions you can process. Latency is how fast those transactions process. From the latency standpoint, if you're doing something on, let's say, Google or Facebook, they really try to have it be less than like, they want it to feel snappy, right? So you want it to be closer to like 100 millisecond, 150 millisecond finality. If it takes longer than that, then users, like they've done research around this, users notice that there's like some kind of like a slowdown on the web page. If it takes more than a second, then users just go to a different tab entirely. Like they just completely context switch. They're not really engaged in that application anymore. So you want the latency to be as low as possible, generally around 100 milliseconds. From the throughput standpoint, I think it's kind of an open-ended question in terms of how many transactions per second is enough. The way that we're thinking about it right now is Google is probably the application, the single application out of the bigger ones that has the greatest throughput requirements at the moment, like definitely more than Facebook. Facebook, I think, is around 4,000 transactions that they need. Visa is somewhere around 20,000 transactions. So if you just think about it like, okay, let's handle Google scale. If you're able to handle something like that, 100,000 complex transactions per second, I think from a performance standpoint, that's generally going to be sufficient. And then from more of a user experience standpoint, you don't want it to feel like you're interacting with crypto at all. So you want the deployment process for developers to be as seamless as possible. And I think there's work to be done over there. Like you should be able to use
a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done over there. From the developer standpoint, it should be really seamless to deploy these things. You shouldn't need to like be, for example, running like your own full node or something to be able to get transactions included in the chain. And then also from a user experience standpoint, you shouldn't need to be like installing MetaMask and like going through the process of like saving your seed phrase. You just be able to like sign in with Google and like just do whatever you want to do. And I think all of these things are going to be solvable problems in the pretty near future. I mean, right before this, I think there was a project that's building exactly what I was describing from the UX standpoint. So yeah, I think a lot of these things are going to improve quite drastically in the next 2 to 3 years.
So you'd want to make those user experience and developer experience enhancing offerings as part of the developer suite in Say?
Oh, yeah. And I think there's going to be a lot of the tooling that gets built up around that. So it doesn't necessarily need to be Say Labs or Say Foundation that is directly involved in that. Like there's already a lot of ecosystem projects that are building some of the things that I talked about from the UX side in terms of, for example, allowing people to just log in with Google. That's not something that we need to build. There's already ecosystem projects that are building that.
And there will be concerns around security and data privacy. What's your thinking around that?
Yeah, so I think whenever you have a decentralized ecosystem, there will be a lot of variety of choices you get for any of these types of tooling that you want built in the ecosystem. So I definitely think security, privacy should be top of mind for folks. And I think that in a competitive marketplace, you will start seeing projects differentiate themselves by having greater security, greater privacy. So I think that's kind of just a market dynamic issue that'll be resolved by having a competitive marketplace.
So are there specific use cases or kinds of products that if a founder is building, that they should seriously consider building on Say first?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an interesting thing that I've been thinking about a good amount recently.
Yeah.
If you think about a blockchain, like what does it really offer to people? I'd make the argument that it offers verifiability. Like that is the core thing. When you're in this like trustless environment, you want to be able to verify stuff that's happening without needing to trust anyone. And that's the core thing that blockchains offer. So what type of applications really benefit from that? Well, anything tied to trading, so the exchange of assets, DeFi, 100% benefits from that.
Sure.
Like if you're using stable coins, 100% that benefits from being built on chain versus having some kind of trusted solution. So I think those type of applications are definitely going to take off on Say, especially once you start having greater scale. Like even right now, Say is able to process around 100x greater throughput than what you see with the EVM. So I mean, this is already happening right now, but there's going to be those types of use cases tied to DeFi that start getting built on Say for sure.
So how do you get experience of building in Web2 to match the experience of building in Web3? What's the appeal to the developers for building on Say so that they're much more empowered and they are greater degrees of freedom to replicate build their experience in Web2.
Yeah. So I think broadly, the way that I think about it, this falls under two buckets. The first bucket is the performance bucket, and the second is the kind of user experience bucket. From the performance standpoint, I think there's two things that matter. It is throughput, which is how many transactions you can process per second, and latency, which is how fast it takes each transaction to go through. From the throughput standpoint, the current mental model that I have is you should be able to get to Google scale. So if you look at Web2 companies, Google needs around 100,000 transactions that it's processing per second. It's much lower for the other ones. Like in the case of Visa, it's around 20,000. In the case of Facebook, it's around 4,000. In the case of Amazon, I read somewhere that Amazon is on the order of like dozens of transactions per second because this tends to be people actually purchasing items. So you don't, like, you want to get, let's say, 100,000 TPS. There's no chain that is even moderately close to hitting that kind of scale right now. Say right now we're getting around 5,000 TPS from load test we've run, and we're 100x better than any existing EVM chain. If you're building on Ethereum, if you're building on an Ethereum rollup that's using Ethereum for data availability, you're not really getting more than 50 transactions per second. So I think that's one part that you need to get to. The second part is latency. And for latency, you ideally want to be as close to 100 milliseconds as possible. So they've done research around this, and basically if it's more than 100 milliseconds, that's when people notice a lag in the screen. If it takes more than a second, then they context switch out. Yeah, they just completely zone out in that case. So you want it to be as snappy as possible. And I mean, Web2, they've done a ton of research around this. They've introduced things such as caching to be able to dynamically load content as soon as you can. In Web3, I think we need to have similar types of things happening where latency is as low as possible, throughput's as high as possible. From the user experience standpoint, I think the onboarding process needs to improve. And I think the actual kind of life cycle of using applications need to just completely abstract away the crypto element. So from the onboarding side, you really shouldn't need to have like a MetaMask, for example, with like your seed phrase being stored somewhere. It should just be like you log in via Google and you're able to do stuff on chain.
Yeah.
So I think there's applications that are doing a very good job of building things like that. And I think the UX side will be solvable, might already arguably be solved, but I think before end of 2025, that'll become much more ubiquitous. And for the performance characteristics, I think that's a much harder problem to solve for any kind of distributed system. So that's what we're very heads down focused on. And I think probably it'll take another couple of years before you start seeing chains that are able to get that type of like throughput and latency that as I described.
But part of the expedited user experience you're talking about does not fall on the chain to improve on. The caching example, or immediacy in being able to populate details of a transaction or a particular experience. What about other products and features of, say, either of the entities? Do you see will have a role to play in generating an equivalence of caching, say, in the wallets, or storing known wallets, known types of transactions to actually make the user experience better? Do you anticipate these will be part of your offering? Or do you think these fall onto other players to build on, say, so that they can hear this as an invitation to come and build, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a great question. So say it's a decentralized ecosystem that has hundreds of people that are participating in it. And if you think about that, that means there's a baseline that the core protocol needs to offer, and everything else is something that the ecosystem will build out. So in terms of the core baselines, I think the throughput that the chain can process, I think that's entirely on the protocol. The finality that the chain offers, I think that's entirely on the protocol. And then a lot of the other things we're discussing, such as being able to immediately like show these, let's say, transaction balances or like token balances on your wallet. I think that's something that will require an RPC layer that's able to serve content very quickly. In terms of being able to like seamlessly onboard with like Google, for example, I think that'll require projects like Privy to get created that'll be supporting that, and that'll be like tooling that's built on top of the chain. So I think there will be a lot of parts of it that require the ecosystem to get involved. But I think that's fundamentally just how crypto works. Like it's never going to be the core protocol that offers everything, especially things around the user experience.
Yeah.
It's going to end up being a lot of ecosystem developers that get involved, and they kind of make opinionated decisions around what direction you should go for like onboarding for user experience. And then the market will decide what ends up mattering more. So I think the protocol should be quite opinionated about a lot of things. You should offer this general purpose high performance chain, and then let other people decide how they want to have the user experience work.
Right. So in that open invitation of, come and build here, what do you anticipate are the key pillars that in order to get, say, to the best developer experience and best eventual end user experience, what are the core pillars and features that kind of need to be built out first, sooner than rather than later, and maybe even before some of the other aspects? If you could magnetize certain groups of builders and certain groups of value propositions before others, what would you prioritize?
Yeah, so like putting aside the protocol layer, we discussed like throughput latency. Like I think that stuff will just be built into the protocol entirely. From a tooling standpoint, I think there's like certain core primitives that need to exist in any ecosystem before you can really start building more complex stuff on top of it.
Yeah.
So I think there's like smart contract side, there's stuff like Dexys, for example, NFT marketplaces, lending markets, like all the stuff that like you've seen and heard before. From the tooling side, I think it'll end up being, you need to have a good wallet. I think that's like table stakes right now, or like some kind of replacement for a wallet.
Sure.
So if you don't support MetaMask, you probably need to create your own in-house wallet. And I think that can introduce a ton of complexity. If you don't have a good wallet, like it's gonna be really tough for people to interact with your ecosystem. I think long-term, this is just going to, like the wallet part of it will be abstracted away, as I was describing before, by something like Privy. So I think that will make it much easier to onboard users, and like that is critical tooling that needs to exist. Another part of it, I think, is block explorers. So ways to visualize what kind of transactions are actually happening and like how these balances are changing. Block explorers are extremely difficult products to build, especially on a high performance chain, because you need to be able to maintain an archive of all the data that's already been there. And you also need to track all the new transactions that are coming in, index them, and then quickly update the balances that are being shown. So all of these are like surprisingly difficult technical problems, and that introduces this entire infrastructure layer of like archive nodes, RPCs, relayers as well, if you're supporting any kind of bridging that need to exist as well.
I hear you. Jay, it's been a pleasure to hear about the origin story and the challenges you've faced and conquered and the vision you have. Any closing thoughts?
No, thank you so much for having me here right now. Say is live with the parallelized EVM on mainnet right now. There's a ton of applications that are getting deployed. So please go ahead and follow Say Network on Twitter and check it out.